War. War never changes.
Some kind of war junkie?
Gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room.
Welcome to the War 102 podcast, where we explore the doctrine, theory, philosophy, and history of warfare. I'm your guide, Paul Darling, and I want to share what I learned in nearly 30 years in uniform. So let's get to learning about the most influential activity in human history, war. Welcome to episode 28, the Arab-Israeli conflict. Lest you think I fly too close to the sun, I will not attempt to delve into all aspects of this, in the modern era at least, 100-year-long conflict in a scant 15 minutes. Rather, I seek to delve into the cultural motivations and misunderstandings that leave this conflict one of the most intractable. In and of itself, how one describes the conflict shapes the narrative. I state the older, more expansive term, which defined the conflict up until the 80s, when the narrative morphed, for various reasons, into the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The history of the region is disputed. The Jews, and this is at its core a religious conflict, believe that they have lived in the land of Israel for somewhere in what is variously called Israel, Judea, Palestine, for 3,000 years. There is both archaeology as well as non-Jewish historical sources to support the claim. And roughly 1,000 years into their living in the land, the conquering Romans expelled the Jews and named the land Syria Palestina, the first name from the name of the larger region, and the second being the Latinization of the Philistines of the Hebrew Bible. The ancient Philistines are believed to have come from Greece, around 3,200 years ago, settling in the region known then and now as Gaza. Due to the proximity to the Jewish nation, there was constant conflict, but by 500 BC, it appears the Philistines, as a separate nation, disappeared from history. And here comes the first and most critical aspect when analyzing grand strategy. It doesn't matter if it is true or not. The Jews, or in nation-state term, Israelis, believe it. This historical narrative shapes their entire country and culture. It is their identity. To the Israeli people, they are an indigenous people returning to their ancient homeland. Please note that the Arabs who live in Israel and other small subgroups such as Druze call themselves variously Israeli or Palestinian. An Arab Israeli is a thing, and they make up 20% of the current population of Israel. Now to the Arabs. The Arab conquest of the Levant occurred only 2 years after the death of Muhammad by Umar al-Khattab in 634 AD. The region had been under the rule of the Byzantine Romans, but under constant conflict with the Sassanid Persians. At this time, the Roman Palestina was divided into 3 parts, which incorporated most of modern-day Jordan, Israel, the Sinai Desert, and the western edge of the Arabian Peninsula, now Saudi Arabia, along the Gulf of Aqaba, and parts of southern Lebanon and southern Syria. At the time, some Arabs lived in what is now Jordan and Syria, prior to the Arab-Muslim conquest, and are believed to have been Christians. Of course, Greeks, Romans, and Persians lived in the region as well. Exhausted by the constant conflict between Persians and Byzantines, the area was easily conquered by the united Arabs under the banner of Islam. This marked the first time since the fall of Jerusalem under the Arabs that a Semitic people ruled the region known as Palestina. To the Arabs, what Westerners call the Levant is known as Bilad al-Sham, literally the region of the left hand, as it is viewed from an Arabian viewpoint. There is also Bilad al-Yaman, or region of the right hand, which comprises modern-day Oman, some of Saudi Arabia, and, predictably, Yemen. The Arabs ruled the region largely from the cities until replaced by the Christian Crusaders in 1099. During this time, there was little immigration from Arabia, and other smaller tribes retained their independence in the mountainous and arid region. Because of this, despite the rule by Muslims, the region of Al-Sham, and specifically the area around Jerusalem, remained majority Christian. Jews lived in small communities in the cities and had their own villages on the coast and in the Galilee. Neither the Crusaders nor the previous Arab rulers partook in mass conversions, keeping the region multi-ethnic, and as such disjointed and quiet. The region was ruled, if such a term could be used, by the Mamluks, with control temporarily surrendered by such various names as Timur the Lame, or Tamerlane, a brief period of the Mongols, Napoleon, till ultimately supplanted by the Ottoman Empire. Of course, by definition, the Mamluks ruled nothing. The term Mamluk means one who is owned, or a slave. They were non-Muslim, non-Arab mercenaries who controlled the regions in the name of the various caliphates. The location of Palestine made it a transit point for untold number of various conquerors who wished to own the region, but little interest in living there. So the Mamluks, most famous for the control of Egypt, exercised real power and controlled the region in all but name. While largely forgotten, the military officer class of today in Jordan is largely made up of a subset of the Mamluks, the Circassians. The northern part of Al-Sham, or Syria, was conquered by the Ottomans under Suleiman the Magnificent in the 1500s, who retained loose control, as with most of the Ottoman Empire, until ultimately giving up the region to the British and French following the defeat of the Entente in World War I. Who has controlled the region of Palestine for the past 3,000 years is varied, debatable, and both irrelevant and critical. But to the Arabs, the history of Palestine is one of native Arab lands being invaded and divided by foreign powers, particularly European. It doesn't matter if it's true or not, it's what they think, and it drives their overarching narrative. The current conflict is intractable from the Zionist movement, so a quick history and definition of Zionism is required. In the mid to late 19th century, Jews in Europe entered what was known as the Jewish Enlightenment. Many sought to assimilate into the predominant culture, and this led to the creation of Reform Judaism, abandoning many of the traditional aspects of Jewish culture in the hopes that the assimilation would lead to greater acceptance. This line of thought dominated in Western Europe. In Eastern Europe, many thought assimilation-based acceptance impossible, and the rising Jew hatred in Europe demanded a safe haven for Jews, with their ancestral home being the most logical location. This was not an inherently religious movement, rather a nationalist movement. In 1897, the first Zionist Congress was assembled, and originally sought an autonomous homeland from the Ottoman Empire, who refused. At the time, the Jewish population was about 40,000 and the Arab population around 400,000. The leadership of the Zionist movement were German. However, the majority of Zionists were Russians, fleeing the Tsarist pogroms, which were accelerated after the failed Russian Revolution in 1905. By 1914, about 50,000 more Jews had moved to Palestine, living on land purchased from absent Ottoman landowners by wealthy Western European Jews, who, while Zionists at heart, weren't Zionists by location. World War I provided a sea change, and Zionist Jews in England pressured the presumed winners to help them in their Zionist dream, which led to the Balfour Declaration, being published in late 1917. Arthur Balfour was the Foreign Secretary, and he published a brief letter to Lord Rothschild, one of the primary financiers of the Zionist movement. In it, he states, and I quote, "His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country." You must note that this document says nothing about a nation-state for the Jews, nor mention of a Palestinian people. This being still the midst of the colonial period, the implied continuation of British dominion was unquestioned. There would be a place for Jews, ruled by Britain and shared by everyone, but not openly shared. The Arabs, both Christian and Muslim, did not welcome the influx of Jews, which only accelerated from Russia and the now Soviet Union. By 1933, the Jewish population had increased to about 200,000. The Jews brought a growing prosperity to the region, long neglected by the Ottomans. Jewish immigration to Israel vastly increased. At this time, there were two distinct types of Zionists. The revisionist wing led by Jablonski, who believed peaceful coexistence with the Arabs was impossible, and the more multicultural wing who, not being religious themselves, saw no reason why sharing of the land was impossible. It was the latter wing that dominated Israeli politics for the first few decades, as led by David Ben-Gurion. Despite some horrific pogroms, little different from the ones in Russia, the coexistence wing of Zionism continued to dominate. World War II and the Holocaust changed everything. By 1939, the majority Arab population in the British Mandate were in open revolt. The leader of the Arabs was Amin al-Husseini, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, a position created by the British in 1921 to ensure his help as a key ally to the new British government. He was only 24 years old at the time of his appointment. Ironically, the Mufti allied himself with Hitler and led a revolt against the British in 1936 that led him to escaping to Iraq. During World War II, he raised an army of 20,000 who served in Hitler's SS and hoped to emulate Hitler's extermination of the Jews with a proposed execution camp in Jenin, built along the same line as Hitler's. Of course, at the end of the war, Approximately half the Jews living in Europe had been killed, and the remaining half, especially in areas of Central and Eastern Europe, were in no mood to stay. The rush was on to get to Israel, and it was at this time the British refused entry to all Jews, placing Jews fleeing Europe into, ironically again, concentration camps on the island of Cyprus and the coast of Palestine. With World War II over, the Jews fought a guerrilla campaign against the British in their mandate. By 1947, the British had had enough of colonialism in general, and the Jews in particular, and threw the problem of Palestine at the UN, who voted, against the wishes of the British, to partition Israel into Arab and Jewish sectors, with Jerusalem under trusteeship of the UN. The Jews accepted, the Arabs refused, and in the name of Pan-Arabism, several Arab countries invaded in May of 1948, when the British lowered the Union Jack on yet another colony. To sum up the end of the war, Israel was divided into three parts. The West Bank, which was annexed by Jordan, creating Transjordan. Gaza was occupied but not formally annexed by Egypt, and set up the All-Palestine Protectorate, which was a puppet of the Cairo government, as Jordan and Egypt wrestled for supremacy of the Arabs in the new nation of Israel. So why all this strategy? Because history matters when it comes to culture, and culture matters in grand strategy. And the current events in Gaza and in Lebanon all come down to a conflict of grand strategies and are not solvable in any long-term sense diplomatically. To wit, the current Palestinian leadership abjectly refuses to admit there exists an historical or religious connection of the Jewish people to Israel. And this was not always the case. Traditional Islam always acknowledged the existence of Solomon's temple in Jerusalem. The original Mufti, Amin al-Husseini, wrote in 1925, "The Temple Mount as the site of Solomon's temple was, and I quote, beyond dispute." By 2000, the undisputed leader of the Palestinian Arabs, via his role as leader of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, Yasser Arafat, despite being born and raised in Cairo, said that Solomon's temple was in Nablus, not Jerusalem. This claim has been repeated by the current leader of the PLO, now referred to as the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, in 2003, when, while giving a speech to the UN General Assembly, he stated there is no proof of Jewish ties to Jerusalem. The current Mufti, Mohammed Ahmed Hussein, repeated this in an interview where he states that the area of the Temple Mount has always been home to a mosque since the creation of the world, and there was never a Jewish temple there. For the point of this discussion, it is irrelevant whether the claims are true or false. It is irrelevant whether the claims are believed or not believed by the Arab or Muslim world. What is inherently relevant is the Jews reject these claims. The grand strategy of the Palestine Liberation Movement is based upon a few baseline assumptions. 1. The Jews living in Israel are European colonists. They have no legitimate claim to the land called Israel, which is part of the reason most refuse to even say the word Israel, instead referring to Israel as the Zionist entity. 2. The struggle against Israel is part of the historic decolonization that took place since the end of World War II. The complete destruction of Israel is morally justified and righteous. 3. This European colony was created solely because of a false narrative of the Holocaust, as a place of refuge for a hated people who have always lived in Europe. From these baseline assumptions, which are treated as facts in much of the Arab world, the strategy is quite simple. If Jews perceive a greater risk from living in Israel as compared to Europe, then they will return to Europe out of fear, hence the reliance on terrorism as the primary tactic. The quest for a two-state solution is dead in the water. From the river to the sea excludes that as a long-term possibility. The brute force solution to the Israeli problem was abandoned after 1973. The fact Israel is at peace with both Egypt and Jordan means the existential threat Israel faced for the first 25 years of its existence is likewise over. From the Israeli perspective, the Ben-Gurion Zionist dream of a coexistence has died for two primary reasons. 1. It was tried and didn't work. Israel unilaterally withdrew from the Gaza Strip and the bulk of the West Bank. There was no peace in return. And second, and most distressing for the Arabs, is that the agnostic Zionist wing is being replaced, and quickly, by a far more religious strain of Israeli. The simple fact is non-religious Jews in Israel have about 2 children per couple. Orthodox Jews have over 6. Orthodox Jews are unapologetic about returning to, in their viewpoint, their ancestral home. They see themselves as the indigenous people of the land. Yet again, whether this is true or not is irrelevant. They think it's true. Terrorizing them will not get them to leave, rather only motivate them to fight back without regard for international public opinion as to how. As the years go on, the demographic reality means the Arabs will be faced with an Israeli government less and less inclined to share any part of what religious Jews call Eretz Israel, or the land of Israel. The most critical takeaway is the most famous of Sun Tzu's many quotes. If you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. It's fine to have a communication strategy which motivates your people and their armies. It's fine that this message need not be the most accurate, but you can never impose your beliefs onto your enemy without force. Always be aware that believing your own bullshit is the route to ruin. It was true in the Falklands. It is true today in Israel. But is it true in Ukraine? A discussion for next week. Thanks for joining us today. If you liked what you heard, please like, subscribe, rate, and comment. Most importantly, share with your friends. Join the conversation at the War 102 subreddit. And check out the War 102 Buzzsprout website for links to more information and supporting videos. Send me an email at war102podcast@gmail.com. I look forward to your comments and hope you join us again next week. See you then.